Throughout its history, the United States has been a land of folklore, legends, and seemingly supernatural occurrences. However, some of those beliefs trace back further than the country itself. Native Americans, with their own sets of beliefs and stories, had legends that would eventually end up fusing with some European myths, leading to the creation of creatures like Bigfoot and Champ. And for those unfamiliar, Champ is essentially America's Loch Ness Monster. Last Halloween, we covered one of the United States' most famous legends, which was the Headless Horseman from the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. This Halloween, I decided I wanted to do something a little bit similar and cover another one of America's most significant legends. Not only is it one of the most significant, but it's also one of the most well-known paranormal events in history. And, of course, I'm talking about the Bell Witch and the Bell Witch haunting. Taking place in the early 19th century, the Bell Witch haunting refers to a strange series of events that happened in Adams, Tennessee. As legend would have it, the town was plagued by an almost entirely unseen entity. However, the brunt of the entity's actions targeted one family, which was the Bell family. For multiple years, each member of the Bell household suffered verbal and physical abuse from this so-called spirit. As word of the events spread, people from Adams and beyond were eager to witness the witch themselves. Legend even claimed that the haunting caught the attention of future President Andrew Jackson, who allegedly visited the house in person. However, years after the events began, they ended just as suddenly, and most of the interest in the story faded. That was until 70 years afterwards, a man named Martin V. Ingram published a book titled The Authenticated History of the Bell Witch. Since its release, it has been the most popular and most well-known source for the events that transpired in Adams, and yes, it's even the main source for this very video. After the book's publication, the Bell Witch was firmly back in the spotlight, and this time, it was here to stay. Now, the tale remains one of the most famous cases of American folklore, continuing to appear in media and even inspiring a tourist attraction, the Bell Witch Cave, which is in Adams, Tennessee. So let's journey back to early 19th century Tennessee and dive deeper into the story of the Bell Witch haunting. In 1804, Tennessee was still relatively young in terms of statehood, having been added to the Union only 8 years earlier in 1796. Before statehood, much of what is now Tennessee was part of North Carolina, which was also the home state of John Bell. Bell hailed from Halifax County, North Carolina, where he pursued a career in farming. Due to the era in which this story takes place, and the fact that most of the available information comes from a document written 70 years after the fact, little is known about the Bell family prior to their migration to Tennessee. However, what we do know is that sometime in 1782, John married a woman named Lucy Williams. Woman is a strong word because while John was 32 at the time, Lucy was only 12 years old. As ridiculously and horribly disgusting as that is, remember we're talking about the late 1700s to early 1800s when this sort of thing was all too common, unfortunately. For the following 20 years after their marriage, John and Lucy became quite popular in their hometown. John was well liked and was a skilled farmer. As for his personal life, by 1804, he and Lucy had 6 children. During those 20 years, reports of findings in what would eventually become Tennessee piqued the interest of many settlers, which included John and his family. Reports told of a beautiful land teeming with luscious forests, beautiful water, and land prime for farming, which, if you've ever had the pleasure to visit Tennessee, you'll know is pretty accurate. So, in 1804, the Bell family made the treacherous journey through the Appalachian Mountains before settling in what would become current-day Adams, Tennessee. There, John purchased a plot of land that was roughly 1,000 acres. On it sat a recently refurbished home, a slave house. The slave house was going to be used because the Bell families were in fact slavers. Additionally, the plot had several barns and an orchard. All of these would be improved over the following decade as John, Lucy, and all of their children settled in and became beloved members of their community. Lucy, above all, was loved the most. She was described as a loving and tender mother, and had made friends with pretty much everybody in the community especially with the other mothers in the community. In 1817, a man named Joshua Gardner had shown interest in John's youngest daughter, Betsy. Betsy was born sometime in 1806, around 2 years after the Bells had settled in Adams. Now, I couldn't find an exact age for Joshua, but in most accounts I've read, they refer to him as a youngster, so maybe he was around the same age as her, so there at least wasn't as an egregious age gap between them like John and Lucy. Joshua was reportedly handsome, well-mannered, and entertaining, and he and Lucy subsequently became sweethearts. The Gardner and Bell family had no objections to the two, and all seemed well. However, soon after the two began seeing each other, someone or something made their disapproval very well known. It all started on a night in 1817 while John Bell was patrolling his cornfields. In one of the empty rows between the two rows of corn, John spotted what he assumed was a dog. However, this dog was unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was pitch black, much larger than a normal dog, and continuously stared at John as John kind of got closer to it for a better look. Possibly feeling threatened, John brandished his pistol and shot at the dog. And John swore that he had hit the dog, but if he had, it didn't even seem to faze the animal. A few days later, Drew Bell, one of John's sons, saw a large bird perched on a nearby fence. Now, at first, Drew figured it was just a turkey, but if it was a turkey, it was by far the largest one he'd ever seen. So he went inside to the Bell home and retrieved a gun because he wanted to, kill this giant monster turkey. But just as he got close enough to fire, the bird spread its wings and took off. When it did this, Drew said it no longer looked like a turkey, but was instead a bird he was completely unfamiliar with, but all he knew was that it was absolutely massive. The next member of the Bell family to experience something strange was Betsy. One evening, while playing in the nearby forest, Betsy saw what she described as a pretty little girl in a green dress hanging by her neck from the limb of a tree. When Betsy returned to the house and tried to show her family, the girl in green was gone. The next encounter was not experienced by a member of the Bell family. Instead, it was an experience of one of the Bell family slaves named Dean. Dean was a house slave and was married to another house slave who belonged to a nearby farmer named Alexander Gunn. Every few days or so, Dean would walk to the Gunn farm to see his wife, but oddly, around the time the other apparitions appeared to the members of the Bell family, Dean encountered an apparition of his own. As he walked down the road, a large black dog began appearing and would follow him until he reached the Gunn farm, at which point the dog would disappear. After their first encounter, the dog would appear to Dean in the exact same spot every single time Dean walked to the Gunn property. Additionally, Dean would say the dog would sometimes appear with 2 heads, or on a few occasions, no head at all. However, after a while, the apparitions disappeared just as quickly as they arrived, and no one really thought much of it. That was until things began happening inside the Bell home. The sound of knocking was heard along the walls and doors of the house and had seemingly no origin. Next, the men of the house, or the boys of the house, complained that they could hear like a gnawing sound coming from their bedposts, and they described it as if it sounded like there were rats chewing on their bedposts while they were sleeping. These noises would later intensify into the sound of dogs fighting, and something that sounded, what the Bell family described as like a chain being dragged across the floor. All of these events would take place during the night and usually in pitch black circumstances, and whenever someone in the house tried to light a candle so they could possibly illuminate wherever these noises were coming from, the noises would immediately stop as soon as there was light. Now, while these events affected the entire Bell family, this apparition or entity began to target 2 members specifically, which was John and Betsy. Now, while most of the other kids complained of the noises and sometimes having their bed covers ripped off them at night, Betsy was suffering what could only be described as full-blown assault. She was reportedly slapped, pinched, poked with invisible pins, and much more. As for John, his experience was by far the strangest up until this point. He soon became afflicted with what was called stiffness of the tongue. And what it was is that John said it felt like as if he had a piece of wood that was like a cross inside of his mouth. So like cheek to cheek, there was just a piece of wood in his mouth. Because of this, he said his mouth would like feel completely numb. And during these events, when this was happening to him, it would pretty much be impossible for John to either speak or eat. The Bell family endured this abuse for a full year before reaching out for help. If you're wondering why John refused to seek any outside help with this entity, it's actually pretty simple. The entire Bell family were steadfast Christians, and given this story's time frame being that of the early 1800s, John Bell would have likely feared admitting to such a problem. Telling other members of his community that his home was being tormented by a ghoul or demon would in most cases cause his family to become ostracized, either in fear of a curse or possibly believing that the Bell family was experimenting with witchcraft. However, after a year of torment, the Bell family was very desperate. John reached out to a family friend named James Johnson and his wife. He laid out the details of the events and pleaded for both of them to stay a night at the Bell home to see if they could somehow aid in understanding just what was happening inside the house. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson accepted, and that night, just around bedtime, Mr. Johnson led everyone in prayer. In his prayer, he also demanded some sort of revelation for the events and threatened that if the presence didn't leave the home, God would surely take care of it. But the entity was not threatened in the slightest. Right when everyone settled down for bed and extinguished their lights, the noises began. Interestingly, the entity seemed keenly aware of the newcomers in the house, that being Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, and seemed to focus its energy entirely on them. In what can only be described as a deliberate attempt to scare or startle them, it ripped the blanket off of them. Mr. Johnson, being a very strong man of the faith, kept calm and began communicating with the spirit and demanded to know its name. It is at this moment I think it makes the most sense that the entity says it is Old Kate Batts's witch. Now, when exactly the spirit received this moniker is unknown, but to me it makes the most sense for it to probably happen at this moment in the story. The following morning, Mr. Johnson told John that this was a serious issue and that he would need more help. It was at this point that John Bell made everyone in the community aware of what was happening in his home. From there, the floodgates were essentially opened. Everyone throughout Adams and beyond wanted to see this witch for themselves. This interest continued to grow when the witch, after Mr. and Mrs. Johnson's stay, became much more vocal, aggressive, and present. It started having full conversations. It loved debating people about the Bible. It had a crazy ability for mimicry, and above all else, was pretty scornful to every visitor and member of the house, except for one. Out of everyone it ever came into contact with, Old Kate Batts's witch, or the Bell Witch as it was increasingly being referred to, showed affection and respect to Lucy Bell. Throughout the entire haunting, the Bell Witch never harmed Old Luce, as it called her, and referred to Lucy as the most perfect woman living. Lucy would use this adoration from the spirit to ask why it wanted to hurt her family, and the witch reportedly told Lucy that she was sorry for hurting her family, but she would never lay a finger on her. Additionally, the witch made one of its intentions very well known to the entire family. Everyone was already well aware that the witch held a deep disdain for John Bell, or Old Jack as it liked to call him. However, as it got more vocal and violent, the witch began declaring that it wanted to and would kill John Bell. When asked why, the witch would only respond with, "Because he needs killing." In the few moments where the witch would leave John Bell alone, it would shift its focus back onto Betsy. Specifically, the witch essentially began torturing Betsy due to her ever-growing relationship with Joshua Gardner. While upkeeping its usual physical and verbal abuse, the witch began tormenting Betsy by constantly either begging or singing to Betsy to not marry Joshua. These events would actually become so intense that Betsy would often stay the night at friends' house to escape the entity. But it seemed like the witch would follow her and continue to torture her for all of that family to see as well. This behavior instilled, not surprisingly, it instilled a great deal of fear in Betsy for her and Joshua's potential future, and tragically, due to the continuation of that abuse, Betsy did eventually end her relationship with Joshua. In addition to the usual torture and torment that the witch placed upon John and Betsy, it also found time to be a general nuisance to the entire Bell family. On multiple occasions, the witch sent members of the family on pointless errands and showed an ever-growing trickster-esque personality. As the years went on, the witch's power and abilities seemed to grow. It spoke clearer, it was more violent, and was more aware of itself and its surroundings. Because of its growth and ability to hold longer conversations, members of the Bell family would often ask who the witch was and what exactly it wanted. Of course, we know it would respond by saying it was old Kate Batts' witch, but as for what it wanted, the entity would say that it was a spirit that was once happy, but has since been disturbed and made angry. When asked what it meant by disturbed, the witch said her body had been disturbed at a nearby Indian burial ground, and according to the witch, during this disturbance, her skull lost a tooth. That tooth just so happened to be lost on the same plot of land as the Bell house. The witch claimed that it was just there looking for the tooth, and it would leave should it be found. Not wanting to miss the opportunity to rid their house of this demon, John and a number of his sons began excavation around the property in search of the tooth. However, after a while, the witch started laughing at John and his sons for being so gullible. There was no tooth, and the haunting continued. Later on, the witch claimed to be the spirit of an early immigrant who had buried a large amount of money near the home. The witch agreed to show the Bells where she buried the treasure, but all the money would have to be given to Betsy when it was found. That was the witch's weird caveat with this, is that she wanted the treasure to be found, but if it was found, all of the money in it would have to be given to Betsy. Knowing the witch's history of mischief, the Bell family initially ignored this idea of this buried treasure. However, the details the witch gave of the treasure's location matched perfectly with a nearby stone near a river. So, a few of the Bell sons began the process of breaking apart the stone to find the treasure beneath. Once the stone was removed and the men began to dig, they, unsurprisingly, realized they'd been tricked. Much like the tooth, there was no treasure, and the witch took great pleasure in once again fooling everybody. By this point, the Bell Witch was a constant fixture of the home. It was always talking, always assaulting, and always spiteful. However, as you can see, one of its favorite things to do was to mess with people, whether that be a typical assault, arguments over religion, spreading gossip and rumors, or proving non-believers wrong. The witch reveled in all of it. It would mimic people perfectly and would prove its power by exposing the personal secrets of newcomers to the house. On one occasion, one of the Bell's neighbors claimed that the witch tried to get in bed with him. The man, William Porter, claimed that he attempted to wrap the witch up in a blanket and toss it into a fireplace in his bedroom. However, as William attempted to drag the witch into the fire, he said the weight of the witch in the blanket was like insanely heavy, and there was an absolutely horrid stench coming from the blanket. Because of this, he dropped the blanket and Kate left the house. Back at the Bell home, after Betsy called off her relationship with Joshua, she seemed to have become essentially immune to the witch's wrath. As for the witch, she had turned most of her violent actions back towards John. He was struck randomly with the stiffness of the tongue we talked about earlier, and a newfound affliction where his face would twitch randomly and violently. All of this culminated when John Bell became bedridden in late 1820. John was now 70 years old and had become increasingly frail over the years, especially after the appearance of the witch. Despite being bedridden, John still maintained a steady schedule for sleeping and waking the family. However, one day he missed his cue, and the family became suspicious. He began sort of oversleeping, and they could tell that his health had just started to rapidly deteriorate. And despite having multiple doctors come to the house and inspect him, none of them could figure out what was happening to him, and it seemed all they could really do was just wait. The entire Bell family watched over him carefully and attempted to make him more comfortable. That was when one of his sons, John Jr., went to find medicine in the cupboard. He noticed something a little strange. There, in the cupboard, John Jr. found a vial filled with a dark liquid. No one in the family knew where this vial had come from. More disturbingly, this mystery vial was half empty. As the family discussed what the liquid may have been, the witch began to laugh and exclaim that she'd finally outsmarted old Jack. It confessed to giving the liquid to John while he slept, and very sarcastically claimed that it would fix everything wrong with him. Fearing the vial may be some type of poison, the family gave the liquid to a cat to see if it was poison, and the cat quickly fell dead from what was obviously poison then. For over a week, John lay unconscious in his bed before passing away on December 20th, 1820. But even in death, John wasn't safe from the witch. After his death, it was reported that the witch began singing, cheering, and bragging about accomplishing its mission to kill John Bell. Even during John's funeral, the witch reportedly sang and cheered as John's casket was lowered into the ground. As legend would have it, John Bell's official cause of death was listed as a supernatural occurrence. After the death of John Bell, the witch seemingly calmed down. The physical and verbal abuse all but came to an end before the witch eventually actually bid farewell to just Lucy in early 1821. But the witch did promise it would return in 7 years. And just as it promised, it returned to the home in 1828. By that point, the house was only inhabited by Lucy and 2 of the Bell sons. Similar to the original encounter, the first sign of activity was the sound of scratching and or knocking along the walls. It then progressed back into ripping covers off in the middle of the night. Lucy and her sons were certain the witch had returned, but they decided to ignore it and deprive it of the attention it so desperately desired. For around 2 weeks, the family endured the abuse of the witch without speaking a word about it to each other. And surprisingly, it worked. The activity soon died down and the witch seemingly left for good. A few years after the witch's disappearance, Lucy Bell passed away. With her passing, the Bell land was split among the heirs, and years later, the Bell family was torn down. The Bell family home was torn down. And that's honestly where we're at, pretty much where we're at with the witch today. The land that was once part of the Bell family land is said to still be home to strange activity and phenomena. However, nothing as intense as the original haunting. As for the land itself, the only piece of the original property left standing is a guest cabin that now sits next to a school, which is aptly named the Bell School. The activity that is present on the property today is most often reported from a cave now known as the Bell Witch Cave. The cave played no part in the original legend besides the fact that there just so happened to be a cave on the Bell family land. Activity in the cave didn't even start to be reported until well after Lucy Bell's death. In 1937, the at the time owner of the piece of land on which the cave is located reported hearing strange noises coming from the cave. And around that same time, a group of campers set up their camp near the cave and were joking, like, not, they were kind of joking and insulting, I guess, the legend, when one of the men spotted a ghostly looking figure standing on the ridge above them, looking down at them. In 1944, a young girl decided to explore the cave, but her lantern she had brought along with her kept being blown out by something. Having explored the cave multiple times and being well aware of the Bell Witch legend, the girl got frightened and quickly ran back out of the cave. In a bizarre twist to that story, it was later discovered that on the day that this girl tried to explore the cave, it was later discovered that two convicts who were on the run were found in the cave. So, in a weird way, it seems like the Bell Witch did try to protect this girl from these runaway criminals. In 1965, a woman interested in the Bell Witch story visited a graveyard where a majority of the Bell family was buried. From behind her, while she was in this graveyard, she reportedly heard a ghostly voice tell her to look around and that she would eventually find something valuable. After searching the graveyard, she found an old belt buckle inside a black iron kettle. When she had the buckle appraised, the appraiser said it was estimated to be about 175 years old. Sometime during the 1970s, a group of soldiers from the nearby Fort Campbell decided to visit the cave. When one of the men began insulting and joking about the witch, he was reportedly grabbed around the chest, like from behind, and thrown to the ground. Then, in 1986, a pair of reporters visited the cave to investigate and actually planned to spend a night in the cave. After they first entered the cave, one of the men heard a knocking-like sound coming from deeper into the cave. A few moments later, both men heard a loud groan accompanied by more knocking. Then the sounds got closer and the men ran back towards the entrance. Once they were back at the entrance, they then heard a visceral, high-pitched scream coming from the cave, and with that, they decided to leave. In 1987, a man walking on a road near the cave had a rabbit cross his path. This is Tennessee, so seeing a rabbit is not that strange. However, what is strange is that the rabbit apparently didn't run from the man, but seemed to actually be following him. Since this is weird for a wild rabbit to do, the man started to become somewhat spooked and began running, but much to his dismay, the rabbit reportedly began running right alongside him. Eventually, when the man ran out of steam and sat on a log, he said the rabbit walked up to him, hopped right up next to him on the log, laughed, and said that was quite a race they both just had. Stories like these continue to occur today in and around the Bell Witch Cave, which continues to fuel interest in the legend. In the present day, you can visit the Bell Witch Cave and tour it, and the interest continues to grow as the cave appears in multiple paranormal programs on television. However, after all of this, you have to wonder how real is the Bell Witch and the legends surrounding it. Throughout the years since the haunting, many skeptics and investigators have heavily scrutinized the authenticity of the Bell Witch haunting. The reason for this scrutiny stems from the fact that the main source of information about the haunting, which of course is Ingram's novel, wasn't published until 1891. That was 70 years after the initial haunting reportedly ended. Also, the avenues in which Ingram got information for the novel were very vague and possibly completely false. For example, an entire chapter in the book is the reported diary of one of John Bell's sons, Richard, which listed their experiences with the witch. However, this diary was never seen by anyone but Ingram, and no evidence of this diary has ever been found. Furthermore, whether this diary existed or not, later Bell descendants said Ingram never returned any sort of papers to them about the haunting. What makes all of this more suspicious is that at the beginning of the novel, a man named James Allen Bell, who was a grandson of John Bell Sr., so the original John Bell that reportedly got killed by the witch, This James Allen Bell stated that years earlier, his father, Richard Bell, met with his brother John Bell Jr. and agreed that no first-hand information of the haunting was to be published or released until all of John Bell Sr.'s immediate relatives were dead. Well, in 1890, the last living immediate relative of John Bell passed away, and James Allen Bell reportedly gave the papers to Ingram. So, not only is the existence of this diary unknown, but there was an apparent pact in the Bell family that all of them had to be dead before any of this information was shared. Both things make a pretty convincing argument against the book, and I do think it's entirely possible that the work was Ingram's attempt to write a ghost story and capitalize on the Bell Witch legend. The last thing I'll say about Ingram's novel is, remember way back in the beginning when I said that Andrew Jackson may have visited the Bell home? Well, as it turns out, that was most likely something Ingram put in the story himself to sweeten the story up. During the years of the witch's original hauntings, Andrew Jackson's location was always closely monitored and reported, and at no point was Adams, Tennessee reported in his itinerary. However, in 1824, Andrew Jackson was in the running for the presidency, and it very well could be that a political opponent attempted to slander Jackson by claiming he visited a witch. Remember, this event is less than 150 years separated from the Salem witch trials, so reportedly convening with witches was still a somewhat valid defamation of one's character. Now, even though it doesn't look good for the reliability of Ingram's work, that's not to say anything odd, or that's not to say that nothing odd was happening to the Bell family. Remember, even before the novel was published, the legend was well known throughout Adams and beyond. Something had definitely been afflicting the Bell family, so what or who was the Bell Witch? Now, I have my own theory, but let's start from the beginning with who the witch claimed to be. If you recall, the witch referred to itself as Old Kate Batts's witch, but who was Kate Batts? Well, as it turns out, there was a woman named Kate Batts in Adams who lived not too far from the Bell family. She lived there alongside her husband, who had suffered he'd suffered some sort of farm incident that left him paralyzed from the waist down, and alongside him, she also had 5 children. Due to her husband's injury, Kate was the primary financial structure for the family and ran the farm. Being a woman and running a family at the time was still taboo, but that was nothing to deter Kate. By all accounts, Kate was a very, dominant and aggressive woman. She was reportedly physically large and would not hesitate to tell off any man who attempted to talk down to her. She was both loved and feared throughout Adams because of this, and the fact that she liked to be the center of attention. The men throughout Adams loved her tenacity and attitude. It was the women of Adams that reportedly feared her. According to some sources, before the Bell Witch haunting, like years before the haunting, many of the women in Adams believed that Kate could have been a witch. Now, I've never heard of this in my life, and I do have some friends that are kind of like in like the pagan circle, I guess would be the best way to say it. But apparently they thought she was a witch because there is some sort of belief that if you give someone a brass pin, if you give a witch a brass pin, that gives that witch power over you. And apparently Kate would always ask people for brass pins, so the women thought she was a witch. Like I said, I've never heard of that before. I don't know if there's any legitimacy to that. I've asked a couple people that are kind of in that circle, and they said they have no clue about that. So do with that what you will. Both before and during the haunting, it was not uncommon for John Bell Sr. and Kate Batts to be seen arguing. Reportedly, this was over a land dispute that Kate swore up and down John scammed her out of. Later, once the entity earned the nickname of Kate, the living Kate scolded and swore at anyone and everyone who accused or even somewhat insinuated her involvement with the haunting. Kate would end up outliving John by 22 years, and for a lot of people in Adams, they just sort of accepted that the entity could have been the work of Kate Batts. Some, however, believe the call was coming from inside the house, so to speak. The other most popular theory was that the entity was the creation of Betsy Bell. This theory was most famously put forward by Joe Nickel, who, if you don't know, is pretty much a professional wet blanket. I've talked about him in a couple different things. He's a skeptic who's just probably one of the most boring people to talk to, if I had to imagine. And although Nickel is the most famous for this theory, many have believed Betsy was behind the haunting since it happened. Their reasoning for this is that they believe Betsy was performing what is called poltergeist faking syndrome. Now, from what I understand, the term of poltergeist faking syndrome was coined by Nickel, no pun intended, and he often uses it to explain or debunk hauntings. The idea is that a member of a family, typically a child, is behind the odd activity and believed hauntings. Why a child would do this often stems from the idea that the child wants attention or just thinks it's funny. Knowing what we do about Ingram's account likely being an exaggerated version of the true story, I could almost rationalize this idea and see it being true if it wasn't for one thing, and that one thing being Betsy's relationship with Joshua Gardner. Now, again, there is a possibility that Ingram used Betsy and Joshua's split to intensify the witch story. However, I actually do believe that Betsy and Joshua were soulmates, so to speak. Betsy was the golden child of the Bell family, and many men were eager to try and swoon her. Joshua, as I said earlier, seems more likely to have been around her age, which is why I think they were so close. However, most of the other men who attempted to court her were much older. Of these men, the most well-known was Betsy's schoolteacher, which is just another reminder of how gross all of this is. My point is that Betsy seemingly had no interest in anyone but Joshua. And a big part of the story that always comes up is that the witch reportedly assaulted Betsy until she broke off her engagement to Joshua. So, why would Betsy pretend to be assaulted in order to call off her engagement to Joshua? Also, why after that did John Bell continue to be targeted by the witch? Did Betsy just really want to make the entire thing convincing? I don't really buy it. Instead, I have my own theory. If you've been here a while and have seen some of my videos before, you'll know I try to come at all of these paranormal topics with some air of skepticism. Because of this, there are things I do and don't believe are real. For example, in my last video, I talked about how I don't believe the Puerto Rican chupacabra is real because there is just enough evidence that points to it being a subconscious creation. Then, all the way back in my very first video, when I talked about Mothman, I believe there's just enough evidence in that case that I do believe that there had to be something strange happening. Now, my thoughts on the Bell Witch lean more towards that latter idea that something was actually happening here that was paranormal. Before you question why I still believe in a spirit despite the near concrete evidence that Ingram's count is unreliable, it's worth noting that reports of the haunting existed long before Ingram's version. It just seems more likely that Ingram took these earlier reports and either dramatized them or just straight up fabricated entire parts of the story. Despite its name, I don't think the entity was a witch. I do believe it was a spirit, and more specifically, a trickster-type spirit. Now, I did touch on the idea of trickster spirits a little bit in my Ouija series, but they are, basically they are a subset of entities, as their name implies, that find great joy in tricks and or tricking people. A key factor that leads me to believe that this is a trickster-type spirit is that it shows intelligence. Throughout the entire haunting, the witch was keenly aware of its own nature, the nature of the Bell family, and seemingly the nature of every person ever to encounter it. It was also well versed in scripture and was pinpoint when it came to geographic locations. That proves to me that the Bell Witch is not any sort of residual haunting. The other thing that to me points towards a trickster type spirit is that the spirit is acutely aware of right and wrong, but will often do wrong to invoke a reaction. We see this constantly throughout the story, and the witch always finds great pleasure in hurting, tricking, or deceiving people. In popular paranormal belief and study, it is widely believed that most spirits feed off of attention and human emotion. But when it comes to the trickster type, this belief seems to go twofold. However, for the spirit itself, this is both a blessing and a curse. As we know, during the climax of the haunting, the witch had the entirety of Adams enthralled with its activity. But as interest in the witch waned and surviving members of the Bell family chose to ignore it, the witch seemingly disappeared. Then, according to various reports, some of which I mentioned earlier, the Bell Witch has made its presence known repeatedly throughout the years since the original haunting. Most often, the entity seems to enjoy tormenting those who dare to question its existence. Undoubtedly, the Bell Witch is one of the most popular and well-known ghost stories and legends. I would wager that a vast majority of people who grew an interest in the paranormal would cite the Bell Witch legend as one of their earliest interests. I, however, can't really say the same. Don't get me wrong, I was aware of the Bell Witch when I first became interested in the paranormal, but I wouldn't say I was too interested in it, nor was it really one of my main inspirations. I think this is mostly because I had always heard about the very shaky legitimacy of Ingram's novel about the story. However, throughout doing my own research for this video, I have grown to enjoy this story. I wouldn't exactly say that it's one of my favorites, but I can see why so many people hold it in such high regard. As I said all the way back in the beginning, America is full of folklore and legends, and people have very strong beliefs and opinions about those said legends. So before anyone gets mad at me for saying this story isn't one of my favorites, remember, I did say I like the story, and even believe something paranormal was and still is taking place. But overall, I think that pretty much wraps up my thoughts on the Bell Witch. I don't have too much to say. I do, like I said, do like the story. I wanted to do something somewhat similar to what I did for Halloween last year, where we did like a classic Halloween tale. And this one's a bit more of a stretch. I'm kind of just saying it's Halloween because it's got witch in the name. But I think I can get away with that. But like I said, I've said it throughout posts, and I've said it floating cat hair in here. The cat's shedding like crazy. But there's a lot of well, now I done lost my train of thought because I was looking for cat hair. I can't remember what I was saying, but it was probably something about Halloween. But yeah, I hope you all enjoyed this Halloween video. It's a little less Halloween oriented than I would say Sleepy Hollow was last year. But I know this is a story that, like I said, a lot of people hold really dear and a lot of people really love. And like I said, can totally see why people love it. I love it because I do love it because it's paranormal themed, but I wouldn't say like it's like Mothman for me with my Mothman shirt and my Mothman hat on right now. I do like the story, but I would recommend if you're doing your own research and want to learn like a lot of the true stuff, you do have to kind of pick through Ingram's novel and figure out with other reports what is likely true and what likely isn't, because I would say a good 50% of Ingram's novel is dramatized. It just exaggerated. It's exaggerated things about the true story, and there are a couple things in there that I'm pretty sure he just straight up made up. So you have to watch that when you're doing this on your own. But yeah, I think that's really about it. I don't have too much to say. In terms of personal stuff, I'm hoping to get another Cryptic Cocktails video out for you all soon. about a topic that I've started researching a little bit. I haven't really like started typing out an outline for it yet, but it should be interesting. Um, as for other personal stuff, as I'm recording this yesterday, um, yeah, I guess it would have been yesterday. Me and my girlfriend did put an offer in on a house, so that might be coming up soon. If something does happen with that, I will probably let you all know through like my community tab here in my posts. Because when that stuff starts moving, if we do end up getting the house, if that stuff starts moving, there will probably not be a video for a little while as we're getting like situated, because we have to pack everything up and then take it all back out. But I will keep you all updated like I always do on here. Hey, so no face cam for this part because I'm recording this after the fact and I'm sitting in the pitch dark editing this video. Um, I know this video is out after Halloween. I've tried to keep you all updated through the community tab here about why that's happening, but I haven't really said explicitly why it's happened. But the reason being is that we actually got approved for the house that we went and looked at. So, like I just said in the video, there's going to be a lot of stuff moving. We're still waiting on like an inspection and an appraisal and everything to be finalized and all that, but that stuff is moving. Now, the thing is, I'm still going to try to maybe get that cryptic cocktail video out before we move, but I will make absolutely no promises about that because everything is happening very quickly. And that was the big personal thing I've been saying in my last few community posts that I was gonna try to talk about in the video. That's it. We're hopefully gonna be in this house pretty soon, as long as everything checks out, everything looks good. So yeah, exciting things. Thank you all so much for watching. I will let you get back to the end of the video where I think I tell you all thank you once again. But yeah, I really can't say how much I appreciate you all for keeping watching these videos, and I am sorry that this didn't come out on Halloween, but I hope now, with you hearing what's going on in the background personally, I hope it somewhat makes up for it. So yeah, thank you all for watching. Um, I think that's pretty much it though, so thank you all very much for watching. I hope you all have a very happy Halloween. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and yeah, hope to see you all again soon.